can't live without a man," whispered the widow.
And I became her curse. Daniel had always thought of the small town of Willow Creek as a quiet place, where everyone knew each other and life moved slowly like the river that ran through it.
He had moved there only a few months ago, hoping to escape the noise of the city and find some peace. Life in the town was simple but kind, with neighbors who smiled politely in passing and shopkeepers who greeted him by name after only a few visits. Breaths. Yet, despite its calm, there were always whispers, stories carried on the wind about people whose lives had taken unusual turns. One of these stories was about Mrs. Eleanor Green, a widow who lived in the large old house at the edge of town. Eleanor's house was beautiful but intimidating, with tall windows covered in lace curtains and a garden that looked like it had once been full of life but had been left untended for years. Daniel had passed by it many times on his walks and had always felt a strange mix of curiosity and caution. The townspeople spoke of Eleanor in low, hushed tones. Some said she was sweet but lonely. Others hinted at something darker, something that made them avoid her. Daniel didn't believe in rumors. He had always thought people's stories were exaggerated, and he had no reason to treat Eleanor differently from anyone else. Their first meeting happened on an ordinary Tuesday. Daniel had gone to the local market to pick up groceries when he noticed Eleanor struggling to carry several heavy bags from the store to her car. She was tall and elegant, though her face looked tired and her eyes seemed to carry a weight that Daniel could not understand. Without thinking, he walked over and offered to help.
"Thank you, young man," she said softly, her voice like a whisper that barely disturbed the air.
There was a strange sadness in her tone, as if she had been carrying this moment of gratitude for a very long time, waiting for someone to notice her. Daniel took the bags carefully, and together they walked to her car. She introduced herself simply as Eleanor, with a small, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes entirely. Over the next few weeks, Daniel found himself running into her more often, sometimes by coincidence, sometimes perhaps not. He began helping her with small errands, picking up groceries, running to the pharmacy, or simply carrying something heavy that she couldn't manage on her own. Each visit, Eleanor seemed more open, though there was always a hint of something unspoken in her eyes. Bah. One day, as Daniel helped her water the plants in the neglected garden, she sighed deeply and whispered, "I can't live without a man." The words struck Daniel. He stopped for a moment, unsure how to respond. There was no anger, no demand in her voice, only a quiet, aching truth that made his chest tighten. He tried to nod kindly and said, "I'm here to help if you need anything, Eleanor." She smiled faintly, but it was not a happy smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they are relieved just to be heard. Even if only for a moment, Daniel began to learn more about Eleanor in small, cautious ways. First, she spoke of her late husband, a man who had been her world, though she never went into the details of his death. She spoke of the house, the garden, and the memories that filled every corner of it. Daniel listened, offering company and support, feeling the growing weight of her loneliness. Yet despite her sadness, there was something magnetic about Eleanor. She had an elegance and a quiet intelligence that drew people to her, though Daniel noticed few dared to come close. The first hints of unease came in subtle ways. Psst! Eleanor would ask him to stay longer than necessary, lingering in the living room as if afraid to let him go. Sometimes her gaze would follow him more intently than seemed natural. Yet Daniel dismissed these thoughts, believing that her loneliness made her cling to any kindness shown her. He was, after all, a kind person himself, and he had always wanted to help others. One afternoon, as Daniel helped Eleanor organize her bookshelves, he noticed old photographs tucked away in frames. Pictures of Eleanor with her husband in happier times, smiling, carefree, unaware of the loneliness that would later haunt her. She noticed his gaze on them and sighed.
I loved him more than anything,
she said softly. And when he was gone, it felt like part of me went with him. I've tried to move on, but I never could. Daniel nodded, unsure what to say. Words felt inadequate. He only knew that he wanted to offer comfort. Yet he had no idea how fragile Eleanor's heart had become. Her words stayed with him long after he left her house that day. "I can't live without a man." It was not a demand, not a threat, simply a truth whispered with the kind of longing that made it almost painful to hear. As weeks passed, their meetings became more frequent. Daniel found himself thinking about Eleanor more than he expected, wondering if his presence truly helped her or if it was feeding a dependency that he did not understand.
He began to notice small, strange things.
Eleanor's questions about his life grew more personal. She asked about his friends, his routines, and even where he would be in the evenings. Her interest seemed innocent at first, but it carried a quiet intensity that made Daniel slightly uneasy. Despite the small signs, Daniel felt drawn to Eleanor's world. Pray. There was a mystery in her that he could not ignore, a sadness that invited compassion. He found himself helping her with the house, cooking meals together and sometimes simply sitting in silence while the evening sun cast golden light across the dusty furniture. Each day, Eleanor's gratitude deepened, and so did her dependence on him. Breaths. Daniel wanted to help, but he started to realize that her need for him was no longer casual. It was becoming a quiet, unspoken demand, wrapped in kindness, but tinged with something darker. One rainy evening, as they sat in the living room with the sound of water tapping against the windows, Eleanor whispered again, almost to herself, "I can't live without a man." This time, Daniel felt a chill. It was no longer a plea for companionship, but a confession of obsession, a hint of desperation that made his heart pound. He realized that Eleanor's grief had not faded with time. It had transformed into a need that was powerful and consuming. That night, Daniel left her house with mixed feelings. He cared for Eleanor, yet he began to feel the weight of her dependence. He wondered if helping her was truly kindness, or if he was stepping into a life complicated by someone else's emotional storm. The small town of Willow Creek, with its calm streets and familiar faces, suddenly seemed more mysterious, brave. Daniel could not shake the feeling that Eleanor's words, whispered softly yet firmly, carried more meaning than he understood. In the days that followed, he noticed how Eleanor's gaze lingered on him longer than usual, how she would ask him to return quickly after errands, and how her smiles sometimes seemed like fragile masks hiding deeper emotions.
Daniel felt both sympathy and caution.
He began to see that Eleanor's world was one built on loss and longing, and that stepping into it was like entering a delicate, fragile structure, beautiful, but easy to break. By the end of that first part of their story, Daniel knew one thing clearly. Eleanor Green was not just a lonely widow in need of company. She was a woman whose heart had been deeply wounded, whose life had been shaped by loss, and whose whispered confession, "I can't live without a man," was not just words. It was a warning, one that Daniel did not yet fully understand but would soon feel the weight of. After the first few weeks of their acquaintance, Daniel found himself visiting Eleanor almost daily. It began innocently enough. He would help her with groceries, water the plants, or organize small things in her large, dusty house. But over time, these visits grew longer and more frequent. Eleanor always had some task for him, a small chore that seemed simple, but together they often turned into hours of conversation, work, or quiet companionship. Daniel enjoyed being useful, feeling that his presence made a difference in someone's lonely life. Yet, he could not ignore the subtle ways Eleanor's behavior was changing. At first, it was small things. "But you would say..." She would ask where he had been if he missed a day. She would inquire about his friends and family, not in a casual way, but as though she needed to know every detail of his life. Daniel laughed it off, thinking that her curiosity was only natural for someone who lived so much alone. But the intensity in her gaze sometimes made him pause. Eleanor's eyes were deep and penetrating, filled with a mix of sadness and longing that he found both captivating and slightly unnerving. Eleanor had a way of making even ordinary moments feel important. When Daniel helped her dust the shelves or wash the windows, she would tell stories about the past, about her husband, their life together, and the dreams they once shared. Daniel listened quietly, sometimes offering a word of comfort, sometimes just nodding in understanding. There was a sadness in Eleanor that went beyond loss. It was as if her life had stopped the moment her husband had died, leaving her trapped in time. Her whispers, "I can't live without a man," became more frequent, almost like a mantra she repeated when she thought no one was listening. Pain. Daniel began noticing other changes as well. Eleanor's home, once just a quiet place, started to feel like a world built around him. She would prepare meals just the way he liked them, leave his favorite tea ready, and sometimes she would linger by the doorway when he left, her eyes following him with a mixture of hope and fear. He began to feel uncomfortable at times, sensing that Eleanor's need for his presence was growing more intense than simple gratitude. Despite these signs, Daniel could not bring himself to stop visiting. There was a pull, an almost magnetic attraction to Eleanor's vulnerability and her beauty. She was intelligent, witty in her quiet way, and the loneliness that clung to her like a shadow stirred a sense of protectiveness in him. He thought he could help her, that his presence might be enough to bring a small measure of comfort and perhaps even happiness. But gradually, he began to realize that Eleanor's need was not something he could easily satisfy. It was consuming, and the more he gave, the more she seemed to need. The town's whispers did not help Daniel's peace of mind. People would nod politely when he mentioned Eleanor, but there was always a flicker of concern in their eyes. Some told him to be careful, hinting that Eleanor had a history of clinging to the people who entered her life. Aspirations. Others mentioned strange stories about past suitors who had left town suddenly, often speaking of Eleanor's intensity as something overwhelming. Daniel had dismissed these warnings at first. He did not believe in gossip, and he felt he could handle any situation with kindness and patience. But as Eleanor's behavior became more consuming, he began to understand the truth behind the town's caution. One rainy afternoon, Daniel arrived at Eleanor's house to help her sort through a pile of old letters and photographs. The rain tapped against the windows, creating a steady rhythm that filled the quiet house. Eleanor moved slowly among the furniture, her eyes lingering on pictures that showed a happier time, a life that had been full of laughter and love.
"He was my world," she whispered to Daniel as she held a photograph of her husband close. "When he left me, it felt like everything stopped."
But I've tried to live, to move forward, but I can't. I need someone. Someone who will stay. Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her that life could still be full of moments worth living, but he realized that Eleanor's grief had deepened into something more complex. Her need for him was becoming emotional, almost like a lifeline she clung to desperately. He felt a mixture of empathy and caution. He wanted to help, but he also began to wonder if he had entered a world that was more fragile and complicated than he could handle. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor's dependence on Daniel grew. She would call him if he did not arrive when expected, sometimes with subtle hints of worry, other times with a quiet sadness that made him rush to her side. Her whispers of, "I can't live without a man," became more frequent, spoken not only when he was present but also when he was about to leave. She seemed to need his presence to anchor her world, and Daniel, despite his good intentions, began to feel trapped in the emotional gravity of her loneliness. It was during one of these visits that Daniel first noticed the intensity of Eleanor's control. While they were arranging her bookshelves, she asked him to move items just so, insisting gently but firmly that certain things stay in particular places. When he hesitated or suggested a different arrangement, she would look at him with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said softly. "But these things, they matter to me." Breath. Everything matters. Please, just help me." Her voice was gentle, yet there was a quiet power in it that made him pause. He realized that Eleanor's need was not only emotional but also increasingly controlling. Even as he felt this, Daniel could not turn away. There was a part of him that believed he could bring comfort and order to Eleanor's life, that his presence might soothe her grief and create a new balance. He started to spend more time at her house, sometimes arriving in the morning and leaving only after the sun had set. Eleanor would prepare meals, ask questions about his day, and listen intently to his stories, hanging on to every word, as if it were a lifeline. Daniel began to feel a quiet tension building inside him, a mixture of admiration, compassion, and an uneasy awareness that Eleanor's need was becoming something more than friendship. One evening, as the sky turned pink and orange with the setting sun, Eleanor took Daniel by the hand and led him to the garden. The plants were overgrown, weeds competing with the flowers that had once been carefully tended. She looked around with a wistful expression and whispered, "I have tried to take care of this garden on my own, but it feels empty without someone to share it with. I feel empty myself. I can't live without a man." Daniel felt a shiver run through him. There was no anger in her words, no demand, only a quiet, almost desperate longing. It was both heartbreaking and frightening. He wanted to assure her, to say something that would comfort her, but he also realized that Eleanor's need was not something he could satisfy easily. Her loneliness had grown into an obsession, and he was slowly becoming the center of her world. In the following days, Daniel began noticing other signs of Eleanor's growing dependence. She would ask about his plans, gently suggesting that he stay longer or cancel other commitments. Best. She seemed to arrange her day around him, preparing meals and activities to ensure he would remain by her side. Daniel tried to set small boundaries, reminding himself that he needed space and that her needs should not consume him entirely. Yet each attempt was met with subtle disappointment in Eleanor's eyes, a sadness that tugged at his heart and made it difficult to leave. The town's whispers returned to his mind more often now. He began to see that the stories of Eleanor's intensity were not merely gossip. Her loneliness had transformed into a quiet power over those who entered her life, and Daniel realized that he was slowly being drawn into her world in a way that was difficult to resist. The charm that had first drawn him to her, the intelligence, the grace, the sadness, was now intertwined with a need that was growing stronger each day. By the end of Part 2, Daniel understood that helping Eleanor was no longer simple, base. It had become a delicate balance, a line between compassion and caution, friendship and dependency. Eleanor's whispered confession, "I can't live without a man," was no longer a simple statement of sorrow. It was a reflection of her deep, consuming need, a need that Daniel was becoming increasingly entangled in. He cared for her, wanted to help, and yet he began to realize that Eleanor's loneliness was not something that could be fixed by kindness alone. The story of Daniel and Eleanor was moving into uncertain territory. The quiet town of Willow Creek, once familiar and calm, now felt filled with tension and unspoken danger. Daniel could not yet see the full scope of Eleanor's obsession, but he could sense that the world he had entered, full of whispered confessions and quiet longing, was more complex and more consuming than he had ever imagined. The first hints that Daniel might be in more than a simple friendship with Eleanor came subtly, almost imperceptibly. At first it was just the intensity in her eyes, the way she would pause as he spoke and study him like she was trying to memorize every detail of his face. But as the days passed, her need for him became more visible, and Daniel began to notice small, disturbing patterns he could no longer ignore. It started with the phone calls. At first, Eleanor would call to ask for help with minor things, a question about a recipe, a request to pick up a book, or to remind him that she needed him to come over. But soon the calls became more frequent and more insistent. She would ask where he was, who he was with, and when he would return. Daniel, though he tried to be patient, felt the tension grow with every unanswered call, as if Eleanor's anxiety depended entirely on his presence. The warmth and gratitude he had first felt toward her were now mixed with an uneasy sense of responsibility, almost like walking a tightrope. One evening, Daniel found a letter slipped under his apartment door. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar, and the words inside were short and alarming. They hinted at Eleanor's past, mentioning previous men who had entered her life and left suddenly, never to return, and warning him to be careful. At first, Daniel wanted to dismiss it as a prank or exaggeration. Yet, the words lodged themselves in his mind. He tried to forget them, but they lingered like a shadow, always at the edge of his thoughts when he returned to Eleanor's house. When he arrived that night, Eleanor greeted him as usual, her smile soft, her eyes warm, but Daniel could sense an intensity beneath her calm exterior. She led him into the living room and began talking about her day, about her memories, about the way the rain had fallen on the garden that morning. Everything seemed normal, yet he felt the weight of something unspoken pressing down on him. Her whispers of, "I can't live without a man," were no longer gentle. They were urgent, carrying an almost desperate need that made Daniel's chest tighten. As days passed, Eleanor's behavior became more controlling. She asked Daniel to stay longer, not just out of loneliness, but as if his absence might break the fragile balance she had built around her life. She would suggest small changes to his routines, not in a commanding way but subtly, making him feel that she knew what was best for him, or perhaps for both of them. Daniel tried to maintain his independence, to set small boundaries, but each attempt seemed to deepen Eleanor's longing, leaving him feeling guilty for wanting space. The turning point came one rainy afternoon when Daniel was helping Eleanor organize a stack of old photographs. They were memories of a life that had once been full of laughter, parties, and family gatherings. Eleanor paused at one photograph, a picture of her late husband smiling broadly at a summer picnic. She traced the edges of the frame with her fingers and whispered, "I never thought I would be alone like this. I need someone who will stay. Someone who won't leave me." Daniel tried to respond with kindness, telling her that life had a way of bringing people together when they least expected it, and that perhaps she could find comfort in memories and in companionship. Eleanor shook her head gently, her eyes glistening. "No, Daniel." "Beat. You don't understand. I can't live without a man. Not just anyone, someone who cares, someone who stays. And I need you to be that person." Her words were soft, yet they carried a weight he could not ignore. After that day, Daniel began noticing other signs of Eleanor's obsession. She started asking about his personal life in more detail. Friends, family, and even casual acquaintances. But she seemed to be mapping out his world, learning where he went, what he did, and when he would return. At first, Daniel thought this was natural curiosity, but soon it became clear that she was monitoring him in ways that were both subtle and controlling. Her dependence was no longer emotional alone. It was beginning to shape his life as well.
Strange coincidences started happening too.
Daniel would think of a task he had to complete outside of Eleanor's house, only to receive a call from her asking if he had done it yet. She would remark on things he had planned to do that he had not even mentioned. The small, innocent connection he had initially enjoyed was slowly becoming something heavier. Something that made him feel both needed and trapped. One evening, Daniel went to visit a friend in town, only to find that Eleanor had called multiple times while he was away. The messages were polite on the surface but carried a quiet urgency. They hinted at worry, concern, and a deep longing that Daniel found difficult to interpret. When he returned to Eleanor's house later that night, she greeted him with a gentle smile, but he could feel the weight of her unspoken words pressing against him. Her eyes seemed to search his face for reassurance, as if she feared he might vanish from her life at any moment. Daniel's concern grew when he noticed Eleanor subtly isolating him from his own routines. She would ask him to cancel plans with friends, suggesting that it was better for both of them if he stayed at her house. She prepared meals for him, arranged the furniture for his comfort, and even suggested that he spend the night so she wouldn't be alone. At first he refused politely, but Eleanor's quiet insistence made him feel guilty, as if denying her was an act of cruelty rather than a simple boundary.
It was during one of these evenings that Daniel began to see the true depth of Eleanor's obsession.
They were sitting in the living room, the rain pattering against the windows, when she suddenly reached out and held his hand. "Please, don't go," she whispered, her voice almost breaking.
I've tried to be strong, but I can't. I need you here.
"You are the only one who understands me." Daniel felt a wave of sympathy, but also fear. The need in her voice was no longer gentle or sad. It was consuming, urgent, and almost desperate. From that night onward, Daniel's visits became more tense, more careful. He wanted to help Eleanor, wanted to provide her with comfort. But he also realized that her obsession was growing beyond his ability to manage. He began to notice that her world revolved entirely around him, and he was becoming the central point of her emotional universe. Every decision she made, every action, seemed tied to whether he would be present or absent. Despite his growing unease, Daniel could not deny that he cared for Eleanor. There was a vulnerability in her that drew him in, a sadness that invited empathy, and a charm that was impossible to ignore. But the more he cared, the more he realized the danger of being entangled in her world. Her whispered words, "I can't live without a man," had shifted from a quiet confession to a quiet warning. He was not just helping her. He was becoming a part of her obsession, a necessary presence that she could not imagine living without. One day, Daniel walked through the town square and noticed that people were watching him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Reset tightened. Rumors about Eleanor's past, about men who had entered her life and found themselves unable to leave emotionally, sometimes even physically. At first he dismissed the gossip, telling himself that it was small-town exaggeration. But the more he thought about Eleanor's growing dependence on him, the more he realized that the warnings were not entirely unfounded. The turning point came when Eleanor asked him to cancel an important meeting he had planned for work. "Brace," she explained softly, almost apologetically, that she felt weak and could not manage alone. Daniel felt torn between duty and compassion. He wanted to help her, but he also recognized that her need was no longer simple grief. It was becoming controlling and dangerous. For the first time, he understood that he was trapped in a delicate balance, trying to provide comfort without becoming consumed by her emotional dependence. By the end of this part of the story, Daniel realized that Eleanor's whispers, "I can't live without a man," were no longer just statements of sorrow. They were subtle warnings of the emotional entanglement he had entered, a glimpse of the obsession that was quietly taking over her life and, increasingly, his own. He cared for her, wanted to help her, and yet felt the first true pangs of fear. The line between kindness and danger had begun to blur, and Daniel understood that the story he had walked into was far more complex than he had ever imagined. Potentially, he could not see the full depth of Eleanor's obsession yet, but he could feel its pull, like a tide slowly drawing him toward a shore he might not be able to leave. The calm of Willow Creek no longer felt safe, and the quiet streets seemed to hide shadows in every corner. Daniel knew one thing. The life he had entered with Eleanor Green was no longer simple, and he could no longer ignore the quiet, consuming force of her need. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel began to feel the weight of Eleanor's presence more heavily than ever before. What had started as casual visits, simple acts of kindness, and gentle companionship had slowly transformed into a constant tension that he could not ignore. Wrath. Eleanor's need for him had grown more intense, more controlling, and the house that once seemed like a quiet sanctuary now felt like a cage. Every corner, every room, seemed to echo with her quiet whispers. "I can't live without a man." The words no longer felt like a plea. They had become a quiet demand, a subtle force that shaped his life without him fully realizing it. Eleanor's dependence on Daniel now influenced everything he did. She would ask him to stay longer than planned, reminding him gently but insistently that she was fragile and alone. She prepared meals for him, organized the house to his comfort, and even arranged the garden so that he could walk among the flowers easily. At first, these acts seemed thoughtful, almost endearing, but Daniel began noticing the underlying pressure in every gesture. Eleanor had a way of making him feel needed, appreciated, and, at the same time, responsible for her well-being. The line between kindness and control blurred until Daniel could hardly tell where one ended and the other began. The subtle manipulations began to increase.
Eleanor would casually mention things she needed him to do, tasks that slowly encroached upon his personal time. She suggested he cancel plans with friends or delay work commitments.
When he tried to refuse, she would look at him with a mixture of sadness and disappointment that made his heart ache. It was never harsh or angry. Her words were always soft, polite, almost apologetic. Yet the effect was undeniable. Daniel began rearranging his own life around Eleanor's needs. At the same time, her emotional intensity grew, breaths and anxieties, often lingering on stories of her late husband, the life they had shared, and the emptiness she felt since his passing. Daniel listened patiently, offering comfort and support, but he noticed a subtle change in himself. He started feeling anxious whenever he was away from Eleanor, worried that her fragile balance might be disturbed in his absence. Her sadness, her longing, her whispers, "I can't live without a man," were now part of the rhythm of his life, a persistent echo that followed him even when he was not physically present. One evening, Daniel arrived at Eleanor's house to find her unusually quiet. Despair. She had been waiting for him, sitting in the living room with a blanket draped over her shoulders. The rain fell steadily outside, a soft patter against the windows. Eleanor looked up at him with eyes full of longing. "I tried to get through the day," she whispered. "I tried to do things on my own, but it feels impossible. I need you here. Please don't leave me alone tonight." Her voice was soft, almost fragile, but Daniel could feel the weight behind it. It was no longer a request. It was an emotional tether pulling him into a place where he felt responsible for her every feeling. The days that followed brought subtle, almost unnoticeable signs that Eleanor's obsession was growing. She began organizing her home around his presence. His favorite chair in the living room was always fluffed and ready, his preferred blanket draped over it. Teacups left by the window at the exact time he usually arrived. She prepared meals and snacks he liked, always ready before he stepped inside the door. At first, Daniel appreciated the thoughtfulness, but he began noticing a pattern that made him uneasy. Eleanor's entire day seemed built around him, and she expected his participation in it. Daniel also began to notice strange, almost eerie coincidences. Tasks he had planned outside the house seemed to align mysteriously with Eleanor's needs. A rainstorm that he had planned to use to run errands suddenly began just as she called to say she needed company. A delivery he had arranged for a friend arrived at the same time Eleanor seemed unusually anxious. These coincidences may have been coincidences, Daniel thought at first, but over time they began to feel like more. Eleanor's presence, her needs, her quiet manipulations, everything began to weave into a subtle but inescapable pattern that shaped his every action. At night, the tension grew even stronger. Eleanor would often linger near him while he prepared to leave, her eyes following his movements. She would whisper softly, reminding him of her loneliness, of her need. Daniel felt a strange mixture of empathy, pity, and unease. He cared for Eleanor deeply, wanted to comfort her, and yet he realized that her dependence was becoming something he could not escape emotionally. He was caught between kindness and fear, drawn in by her vulnerability, yet aware of the consuming nature of her need. One particularly tense evening, Daniel tried to set a small boundary, He explained that he had to attend a meeting in town, something important for his work. Eleanor's expression softened, but he noticed a flicker of something darker. Fear, perhaps, or desperation. She asked him gently if he could stay longer, if he could delay his plans by just a little, for her sake. Daniel felt the familiar tug of guilt and concern. Her voice was soft, her eyes wide and vulnerable, and he found himself agreeing despite knowing that it would compromise his own responsibilities. It became increasingly clear to Daniel that Eleanor's emotional state was fragile and volatile. Breath. She was no longer simply lonely. She was dependent, almost desperate. Her life revolved entirely around the presence of a man, and he had unwittingly become that man. Her whispered confession, "I can't live without a man," was no longer just words. It was a truth that shaped her every thought, her every action, and increasingly his own. Daniel began feeling trapped in a subtle way. He was not physically confined, but emotionally he felt a pull he could not resist. Eleanor's constant need, her carefully orchestrated environment, her quiet manipulations, they all created an invisible weight that pressed on his shoulders. But he wanted to help, wanted to be kind, but he also realized that her obsession was consuming him, shaping his thoughts, his schedule, and his emotions. Breath. Every step he took seemed to revolve around her needs, and every decision felt like it carried the risk of causing her pain or anxiety. Despite the growing tension, Daniel could not deny that he cared for Eleanor. He was drawn to her intelligence, her charm, her vulnerability, and the beauty of the memories she shared with him. But the deeper he became involved, the more he recognized the danger of the situation. Eleanor's need was no longer a quiet longing. It was an emotional force, one that could overwhelm him if he was not careful. He began to see that he was entangled in something far more complex than he had imagined, a delicate balance between compassion and self-preservation. One rainy night as Daniel prepared to leave Eleanor's house, she stood by the doorway and took his hand gently. "Please," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. Breath. "I can't be alone tonight. I need you."
Just stay a little longer. Daniel felt a mix of sympathy and fear.
Her words were soft, almost pleading, but the intensity behind them made him feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He knew that staying was not simply a choice. It had become a silent expectation, a demand embedded in her quiet dependence. By now, Daniel understood the reality of Eleanor's obsession. She was not merely lonely. She was emotionally dependent on him in ways that were consuming and subtle, manipulative yet gentle, dangerous yet tender. Her need for him shaped the environment around him, dictated his actions, and pressed upon him with quiet but undeniable force. He had become the center of her emotional universe, and there was no simple way to extract himself without consequences, emotional, psychological, or otherwise. Part 4 ends with Daniel realizing that Eleanor's obsession was not just a passing stage of grief or loneliness. It had grown into a quiet but powerful force that controlled not only her life but also his own. He cared for her, wanted to help, but he also feared the emotional cage he had entered. The tension was now at its peak. Daniel was emotionally trapped, caught between compassion, fear, and the consuming weight of Eleanor's whispers. "I can't live without a man." He knew one thing for certain. The life he had entered with Eleanor Green was no longer simple, safe, or predictable. Her obsession had escalated into something dangerous, not in a violent way, but in a quiet, consuming way that threatened his sense of freedom, his emotional stability, and perhaps even his future. And Daniel realized that the most challenging part was yet to come. The days that followed felt heavier than anything Daniel had ever experienced. Eleanor's whispers, her soft pleas, and the quiet tension in her eyes had become a constant weight on him. Every time he stepped into her house, he felt the invisible pull of her need, and every time he left, He was haunted by the thought that she might be left completely alone, fragile and desperate. But Daniel realized that the situation had reached a point where simple kindness was no longer enough. He needed to make a decision, one that could change both of their lives forever. Narration. He had spent weeks thinking carefully about what to do. Eleanor's dependence on him had grown into something consuming, something that was not just about companionship, but about control, emotional entanglement, and a subtle kind of manipulation that Daniel had only begun to recognize. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that he could not continue without setting firm boundaries. But Daniel also knew that confronting Eleanor would not be easy. She was fragile, wounded by loss, and desperate for someone to fill the emptiness her late husband had left. One rainy afternoon, he arrived at Eleanor's house with a heavy heart. She greeted him as usual, her soft smile carrying the familiar warmth, but Daniel could see the intensity in her eyes, the need, the longing, the unspoken expectation. He tried to steady himself, knowing that this conversation would be one of the most important and difficult he had ever had. "Eleanor," he began carefully, "we need to talk." Her smile faltered slightly, and she gestured for him to sit. The room was quiet except for the soft patter of rain against the windows. "What is it, Daniel?" she asked, her voice gentle but cautious. He could see a flicker of fear in her eyes, a hint that she sensed the gravity of what he was about to say. Daniel took a deep breath. "I care about you, Eleanor. I have cared about you from the beginning, and I will always want the best for you. But I cannot be everything you need. Your happiness cannot depend entirely on me. It is not healthy for either of us."
Eleanor's lips trembled slightly and her eyes glistened with unshed tears.
For a moment she was silent, as if trying to process his words. Daniel continued gently. "You have so much strength inside you, Eleanor. I've seen it. I know you can take care of yourself, even though it feels impossible right now. I want to help, but I cannot fix your grief or your loneliness for you. That is something you must do on your own." Her whisper came softly, almost pleading. "But Daniel, I can't live without a man."
You are the only one who stays, the only one who understands me. If you leave, I'll be alone again.
Bows. Ow. Fall apart. Ow. He reached out, taking her hand gently. "I will not leave you in the sense of abandoning you, Eleanor. I will continue to be your friend, but I cannot be the only reason for your life. You must find your own strength, and I must find mine. We cannot be trapped in this dependence." For a long time, Eleanor did not speak. She sat quietly, staring at the rain outside the window, her fingers gripping his hand tightly. Daniel waited patiently, letting her absorb the reality he was presenting. Bah. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to nod, as if accepting something she had been avoiding for a long time.
I understand, she whispered, her voice trembling.
I've been so lost. I thought I needed someone to live, but maybe I need to find myself first. Daniel squeezed her hand gently and smiled softly. "Yes, Eleanor. Desperate. You are strong, and I will be here as your friend while you rebuild your life. But you must take the first steps on your own." Over the next few days, Daniel carefully began to distance himself. Not abruptly, but gradually. He reduced the frequency of his visits and encouraged Eleanor to engage in other activities. Gardening, visiting friends in town, and reconnecting with small hobbies she had abandoned after her husband's death.
At first she struggled.
There were moments of sadness, quiet tears, and whispered reminders that she felt alone. But Daniel remained patient, giving her space while continuing to offer support as a friend rather than a lifeline. Slowly, a change began to appear. Eleanor started taking small steps toward independence. She spent afternoons in her garden tending the plants with care, smiling quietly as flowers bloomed under her touch. She visited neighbors, sharing small conversations and gradually reconnecting with the world outside her house. Daniel noticed these changes and felt a quiet relief. Eleanor's need for him had not vanished entirely, but it had shifted into a healthier form. She was learning to live, even without being dependent on someone else to anchor her life. One evening, as Daniel visited for a short cup of tea, Eleanor spoke softly. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, her gaze fixed on the garden outside. "I realize now that my grief made me desperate. I thought I couldn't survive without someone by my side, but maybe I can. Maybe I can live, even if it's not exactly the life I imagined." Daniel smiled warmly, feeling a sense of hope he had not felt for weeks. "You are capable of more than you realize, Eleanor. And I will be here to support you as a friend while you rebuild. You are not alone, even if you don't rely entirely on me." Over time, the balance between them shifted. Eleanor's whispers of, "I can't live without a man," became less frequent, and when she spoke them, it was often with a new understanding, a recognition of her own resilience, rather than a plea for dependence. Daniel's presence remained important, but it was no longer a tether that controlled her life. Instead, it became a supportive friendship, grounded in respect, care, and healthy boundaries. The townspeople began to notice the changes too. Eleanor, once isolated and withdrawn, started participating in community events, chatting with neighbors, and even helping in small ways with local gatherings. "Psst," Daniel observed quietly, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. He had not only survived the emotional weight of Eleanor's obsession, but had also helped her take the first steps toward independence. It had been a difficult emotional journey, but it was a journey that ultimately strengthened both of them. One afternoon, as Daniel prepared to leave Eleanor's house after a visit, she stood at the doorway and smiled. "Thank you, Daniel," she said softly. "For staying, for understanding, for helping me see that I can survive. I will always be grateful for you." Daniel smiled in return, feeling the emotional weight lift from his shoulders. "You don't need to thank me, Eleanor. You've done the hard work yourself. I only helped you see what you already had inside." Back. As he walked back through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, Daniel reflected on the journey he had shared with Eleanor. It had begun with innocent help, moved into subtle tension, and reached a point where both their lives were intertwined in ways that had been difficult to navigate. But through patience, understanding, and courage, they had found a path that allowed both of them to reclaim their lives. Eleanor had learned to live without being dependent on someone else, and Daniel had learned the limits of empathy and the importance of healthy boundaries. Great. Eleanor remained a widow, and the memory of her husband never left her. But she had discovered that she could survive, grow, and even find small joys in life without being entirely reliant on another person. Daniel, too, had changed. He had learned the quiet but profound truth that caring for someone sometimes means stepping back, allowing them to face their fears and challenges and trusting that they can find their own strength. The story ends with a quiet, reflective note. Eleanor's whispers, once urgent and desperate, now carry a new meaning. They are reminders not of obsession or need, but of resilience, of growth, and of the strength that lies within every human heart, even in the face of deep loss. Daniel's presence had been a catalyst, but the true change had come from Eleanor herself, a testament to the power of patience, empathy, and the courage to face one's own loneliness. As the sun set over Willow Creek, painting the streets in warm golden light, both Daniel and Eleanor felt a sense of peace. They had navigated the difficult waters of grief, obsession, and emotional dependence, emerging stronger, wiser, and more aware of the delicate balance between compassion and self-preservation. And while Eleanor would always remember the whispers of the past, they no longer held power over her. They were echoes of a time when she had been lost, now replaced by the quiet, steady strength of a woman who had found herself again.